Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dives. You know, today we're going to try to tackle something pretty tricky. We're diving into how mission work and money kind of bump up against each other, especially when you've got, Western missionaries working in, say, lower income communities. The stuff we've got to look at today, it offers some really interesting and sometimes unexpected views on what seems pretty simple on the surface, right? Offering help.
Yeah, it's not always as straightforward as it seems, is it? We're going to come at this from all sorts of angles. We've got stories straight from missionaries who've been doing this work for years, and of course, how they look at the Bible and the verses that guide their work.
Right.
Plus, we'll look at how different cultures think about money and some, scholarly stuff about the bigger picture of it all.
Exactly. And you listening, you might find yourself thinking, what about the finer points of doing this kind of work across cultures? Or maybe you'll start wondering if, our usual ideas about being generous or even just helping really make sense everywhere. So in this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack all these knots and twists. We'll look at different ways people approach this, and hopefully when we're done, you'll have a much clearer picture of this whole multi-sided thing.
Right on. So let's just jump right in. There's a situation Phil Parshall talks about. He was a missionary in South Asia for a long time. He tells about this young missionary named Gary who was super excited because these three farmers, local guys from a Muslim background, they decided to become Christians.
Oh, wow.
They were getting close, meeting all the time, sharing their new faith, over tea and everything.
Sounds like a great start.
It was. Until one day, a cold January afternoon, these new believers come to Gary. Now, their homes were pretty basic, and the wind was just whipping through the cracks. They'd seen how warm and cozy Gary's kids were, so they asked him, could you maybe spare some blankets? Or maybe some extra clothes for our kids?
And that's where things get a little complicated.
Yeah, it kind of throws you a curveball.
You're listening. Put yourself in that spot.
Yeah.
How would you react to that? Seems like a pretty reasonable, compassionate thing to ask.
Absolutely. I mean, you care about these people. They've got a need. It's cold. Your first thought is probably, of course I'll help. But we're going to see, something that seems like a simple act of kindness can have some pretty big ripple effects down the road.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting.
And this is where those tensions start popping up. So Parshall, he brings in some of those big Bible passages that, a lot of missionary work is based on, versus we all know about generosity, like Luke chapter 6, verse 30, give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, don't demand it back.
Right.
Then there's Luke 12.33, sell your possessions and give to the poor.
Powerful stuff.
And 1 John 3.17, if anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him?
Hey.
And then James 2.15:17, this one's right on point, talking about seeing someone without clothes or food and just saying, good luck. What good is that?
Those verses, they seem pretty straightforward, don't they? A direct order to give and take care of those in need. You can see how a missionary, reading those might feel like, got to give those blankets, no question.
Yeah, totally. But here's where it gets really interesting. Parshall, he talks about how he wrestled with taking those commands literally, especially somewhere like Bangladesh, where so many people are poor.
I see.
He even jokes, if he followed them word for word there, he'd probably end up with nothing himself.
Right.
The point he's making is, yeah, be generous, that's clear. But just blindly applying these without thinking about the bigger picture, it can backfire. And it might not be the most helpful or practical thing in the long run.
That really makes you think, doesn't it? It's not enough to just have good intentions. You've got to be smart about how you put them into action, especially when you're dealing with widespread poverty.
He even tells this story about a missionary, real well-meaning guy in this super poor country. The missionary was trying to follow those verses literally, so he'd give a little money every day to all the beggars who'd come to his gate. He thought he was doing the right thing, but it was only enough for a meal, not for anything lasting like warm clothes. And when he finally left, there were just too many people. It was overwhelming. Those beggars, they were angry, not grateful. It really shows you how even when you mean well, if you don't think things through, you can accidentally make things worse.
It all comes back to context, right? And that takes us right into the culture part of all this. Joseph Cumming, he talks about how different cultures see money and relationships, specifically comparing Muslim and Western views.
Right.
And this isn't just about Muslim cultures. These differences can be found in lots of non-Western places.
What's wild is how different the basic ideas about money and friendships can be. Like Cummings says, in the Muslim view, if you're really friends, at some point money's going to be involved. But in the West, we often think the best friendships are the ones where money doesn't come into it at all.
That's so
So
interesting.
that Western idea of keeping friendships and money separate, it's not a universal thing, and that can lead to some big misunderstandings.
And even the way you say no to a request is different. Cumming points out that in a lot of non-Western culture, saying no directly is like a huge insult. It can really hurt a relationship. So they might say no indirectly. But Western culture,
Yeah.
we like things direct. We value being truthful and clear. Talk about a recipe for mixed signals.
Totally. And then there's how rules and relationships stack up. From what these sources say, it seems like in lots of non-Western cultures, being merciful and keeping the peace in a relationship is more important than sticking to the rules. But in the West, we tend to think rules are king, for fairness and order.
It's a totally different way of looking at things.
And that difference goes for obligations, too, like the idea that if you help someone financially, they now owe you something. In some cultures, getting help means you're kind of obligated to be loyal to the giver. But in the West, we see loyalty as something you earn, not something that comes automatically with a handout.
That makes sense.
And then there's this seemingly small thing, but it can be a big deal: how gifts are used. The sources point out that in some cultures, if you get a gift for a certain thing, but then something more urgent comes up, it's okay to use that gift for the bigger need. But in the West, we see that as wrong. You'd need permission from the person who gave the gift. Imagine the problems that can cause.
Yeah, that could definitely lead to some tension.
Totally. All these cultural bits and pieces show us how dangerous it is to just assume that our Western way of thinking about money and relationships will make sense everywhere else. And that brings us to the potential problems with giving money. Partial talks about this sneaky slide towards dependency that can happen even when you have the best intentions. He says he's never seen a situation where someone becomes dependent and it feels good.
Right, that makes sense.
What really hit home for him was when he was called Boro Sahib in Bangladesh. It means VIP. Now, they probably meant it as a sign of respect, but it actually created this distance, like a power thing, and made it harder to really connect with the local people.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that.
So even without meaning to, just by showing you're wealthy can build walls between you and the people you're trying to reach.
That's a really powerful point.
Yeah. And he compares that to when he and his wife lived in this small town, not in the capital, without any servants or fancy stuff. There, people called him Bhai, which means brother.
Nice.
He felt truly welcome, much closer to the Muslims he was trying to connect with. It shows you how much your lifestyle can affect how people see you.
That's a great illustration. And that leads us to how missionaries choose to live. It's tough for a lot of them to drastically lower their living standards to match the communities they're serving, right?
Yeah, for sure. It can be hard emotionally and physically, and sometimes it burns people out.
And this is where Jonathan Bonk's view comes in. He says that often, without even trying, missionaries end up being the wealthy ones, just because of how much richer their home countries are compared to where they're working. It's almost unavoidable.
Yeah, that's just the reality of it.
So Bonk has this idea of the righteous rich. He's saying that missionaries, and really any Western Christians who are in this position, they need to just own it, be aware of it, and learn how to handle those expectations in a way that respects the culture and, lines up with the Bible.
It's like, you're not going to erase the difference in wealth. That might not even be possible, but you can understand what it means to be seen as wealthy in that culture and try to be the good kind of rich person.
That's a really interesting way to put it.
And Bonk says people are pretty good at telling the difference between people who use their wealth to help others and those who are just greedy or selfish. Missionaries should aim to be the helpers, and they need to constantly check those cultural ideas against their faith so they're living what they preach.
Absolutely. Now, another big area where money and missions overlap is supporting local ministers financially. To a Westerner, that can seem like the best way to grow the church, right?
Yeah.
Local people know the culture, they speak the language perfectly, they often don't need as much to live on. Seems pretty logical and efficient.
Makes sense on paper. But Partial, he points out some big downsides. The biggest: the risk of making people dependent. He's seen cases where locals get resentful, even angry, when the money from overseas dries up.
Yeah, you can see how that would happen.
But even worse is how it looks to the non-Christian community, the people missionaries are trying to reach. They might see the local minister as just a paid worker, like a vendor for a foreign religion. And that can completely ruin their credibility and make their faith seem fake.
That's a crucial point. It's like if people think the minister's only there for the money, it's going to be so much harder for them to make real connections and have a genuine impact.
Exactly. Parshall tells this great story about his own team. They partnered up with a Muslim background believer who was getting support from another organization, OM.
Operation Mobilization.
Right, OM. And because the money came from them, it was more like a partnership between equals. This guy was super effective, and the local Muslims didn't see him as just a hired hand. In a place where there were no known Muslim converts before, this guy was key to a movement that now has over 600 believers.
Wow.
It really shows you how important it is who's giving the money and how it's perceived. Parshall also talks about the Philippines, where local churches are stepping up and taking responsibility for their own evangelists. That gives them ownership and avoids that dependency trap.
That's a good model. And then there's the whole issue of loans and grants. Parshall talks about how he was bombarded with requests for loans in these really poor countries, and sadly, he ended up losing both money and relationships because of it.
It's a tough situation. You want to help, but lending money in those contexts can be a recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
Mm.
So he decided to stop doing loans altogether and just stick to grants. And even then, he was super careful. He'd assess the need thoroughly, talk to people he trusted, pray about it, and look at local giving customs. Plus, he always kept in mind that he had more resources than the people he was helping.
That makes sense. And that brings us back to Gary and the blanket request.
Mhm.
After thinking about all the potential problems, like accidentally making people think they could trade faith for stuff, creating dependency, and maybe even messing up future outreach, he decided to talk to the men about his concerns.
Oh, interesting.
Instead of just giving them blankets, he told them that God could provide for them through prayer.
And how did they take that?
Well, they weren't exactly thrilled. They went back to their village looking pretty disappointed.
I bet.
But here's the amazing part. The next week, they came back to Gary, not to complain, but to share how God had taken care of them in ways they never expected. And get this, over the next few decades, those three guys became leaders in a huge self-supporting community of believers, over 500 people, with almost no outside financial help.
That's a powerful story.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that sometimes the best way to help isn't to just give something material right away. You need to think long-term and trust that God can work things out.
Exactly. And Parshall's big takeaway is so important. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. He says we need to keep trying new things, adapting, and really understanding each culture. There are no easy answers or universal formulas here.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And he really emphasizes that this whole thing about missions and money needs to be a front and center conversation in the mission world. How we handle money shapes the very foundation we're building.
And for you listening, it shows how even something as simple as being generous requires a deep understanding of the culture and thinking about the long-term effects.
So to wrap up our deep dive today, we've looked at the challenges of balancing immediate needs with lasting, sustainable solutions. We've explored the ins and outs of how different cultures see money and the things people with more resources need to consider when working in poor communities.
The sources we looked at really stress how important it is to understand the local point of view, work hard to avoid creating dependency, and prioritize real relationships built on mutual respect over just handing out aid.
So we'll leave you with this thought to chew on. Given all this complexity, what does it really mean to truly help someone in a different culture and economic situation? Think about your own ideas about aid and generosity in light of what we talked about today.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you a better understanding of this super important part of cross-cultural work. Think about how these ideas might apply to your own life and how you see global interactions. That's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.